रब्बि इश्रह ली सदरी वयस्सिर ली अमरी वहलुल उक़दतम मिन लिसानी यफ़क़हू क़ौली अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम अस्सलामु अलैकुम. Let's start the brief explanation of the 25th para with a dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for us to understand it and implement it in our lives. Ameen. Surah Ash-Shura. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Ash-Shura, which was revealed in the 13th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is to understand the obligation of establishing the religion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 8, if Allah had so willed, He could have made them all a single community. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that if He had willed, He could have made man without the freedom of choice, and everyone could have just been one community. Then they would have been as obedient as the rivers, mountains, trees, and all the other creatures. It would have been very easy for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to do so. But then there would have been no test and no need for a heaven or hell. Next, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us in verse 13 that this religion is not something new. It is the same religion which was sent to all the previous prophets, and that should be the point which should unite us all. It's understandable that we might have differences of opinion about some matters, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to be united as a nation, united in our worship of one God, united in upholding justice, united in our way of life. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informs us in verse 14 the reason why divisions take place between people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they did not split up except after knowledge had come to them, and then only because they wished to commit excesses against each other. Divisions happen due to envy, the urge to humiliate and defeat one another, and the greed for wealth and possessions. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 20, if anyone desires a harvest in the life to come, we shall increase it for him. If anyone desires a harvest in this world, we shall give him a share of it, but in the hereafter, he will have no share. We are being told in this verse that we are given what we work for. If your priority is the reward of the hereafter, you will get your share in this world too, but the real reward will be kept for you for your later life. But if your focus is primarily on this world, then you will lose out in Akhirah. It's as simple as that. The choice is yours. In verses 36 to 39, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala first explained to us that whatever wealth a person has is temporary. He uses it for a few years and then leaves the world empty-handed. But the wealth Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in store for His true believers, that wealth is far more superior in its quality, and it's also eternal and everlasting. The people who will get this wealth will have the following qualities. Number 1, they believe and put their trust in their Lord. Number 2, they avoid major sins. Number 3, they avoid shameful deeds. Number 4, they forgive when angered. Number 5, they respond to their Lord. Number 6, they establish prayers. Number 7, they conduct their affairs by mutual consultation. Number 8, they donate from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has provided for them. Number 9, they enforce justice when wronged. Let's discuss some qualities a little bit more. What does it mean that they conduct their affairs by mutual consultation? Consultation is an important pillar of the Islamic way of life. Whether it's an issue regarding the state or a business matter or a simple decision regarding a family. By consultation, we move from personal opinions to common interest, and it also builds trust, which is vital for unity and progress. Let's discuss the last quality as well. They enforce justice when wronged. It means they are not so weak that anyone can just walk over them. If a wicked person commits violence against them, they resist and fight with all their might. But when they themselves are in a position of power, they avoid being vengeful and forgive the mistakes of a weak person. Surah Az-Zukhruf. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Az-Zukhruf, which was revealed in the last period of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's stay in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is a call to accept the God of heavens as the king of the earth. The surah starts with an introduction to the Quran. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 7, yet never did a prophet come to them, but they mocked him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us that this is a common action of all wrongdoers, that they ridicule the ones who are trying to spread goodness. All prophets had to endure this, and all of us today who try to follow our deen are made fun of as well. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains the wisdom behind the distribution of resources in verse 32. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He is the one who distributes wealth, power, honor, fame and beauty etc. among His subjects. He has not given everything to one person, and it's not as if someone has been given nothing. It does seem to us sometimes that someone's life is perfect, but we never know what that person is really going through. So you shouldn't complain about your lives, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's best for you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 36, and whoever is blinded from remembrance of the most merciful, we appoint for him a devil, and he is to him a companion. What is meant by the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here? In addition to ritual acts of worship like namaz, etc., remembrance covers many activities of the tongue and the heart. It involves thinking of and talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our daily lives. When we get so busy in our lives, we forget to remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Shaitan becomes our companion. You must have experienced this in your life as well. When we are away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we get sad, depressed, and anxious, right? Verse 67 again warns us about our friends. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, close friends that day will be enemies to each other, except for the righteous. Check your friend list. Who are your friends? Do they bring you close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or away from Him? Are you filled with motivation to do good when you part from them? Or are you demotivated? Think about it. The last verse of this surah, verse 89, guides us on what our action should be concerning the people who don't believe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, but turn away from them and say peace, but soon shall they know. Meaning, overlook their false arguments and don't curse them or respond with harsh words. You should just wish them well, make dua for them, and take your leave. Surah Ad-Dukhan. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Ad-Dukhan, which was revealed in the 7th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is a warning of the punishment given to the arrogant rejectors of Quran and Tawheed. The opening verses of this surah are especially important for us in the last 10 nights of Ramazan. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, indeed, we sent it down on a blessed night, for we always warn against evil. On that night, every matter of wisdom is ordained. What was sent on a blessed night? The Quran, which is so special that the night it was sent down is also special. We learn in Surah Qadr that there is a night in the last 10 nights of Ramazan which is better than 1,000 months, meaning 83 years. This is the entire lifespan of a person, right? Verses 17 to 33 narrate the story of Hazrat Musa alayhi salam and the Pharaoh. Here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes the example of Pharaoh to explain to us the reality of life. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, imagine how many gardens and springs the tyrants left behind, as well as various crops and splendid residences and luxuries which they fully enjoyed. So it was, and we awarded it all to another people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is asking us to imagine the riches of the most powerful man on earth, the Pharaoh. What do you think happened to all his assets? We see with our own eyes that the people who leave this world leave everything behind. They are buried in just some white clothes, and that is the only worldly thing that they take with them. The same is going to happen to us. All our possessions which we have collected and which we are so attached to are going to be left behind. Only our deeds go with us, whether good or bad. Verses 43 to 50 describe the treatment given to the sinners in hell. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the most horrible food and drink they will be given and says in verse 49, the wicked will be told, taste this, you mighty noble one. The mightiest, the noblest, the richest, the most powerful ones will be given the same treatment as the ordinary sinners. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all from the punishment of hellfire. Ameen. Verses 51 to 57 describe the blessings of paradise given to pious believers. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, indeed, the righteous will be in a secure place, amid gardens and springs, dressed in fine silks and rich brocades, facing one another. So it will be, and we will pair them to maidens with gorgeous eyes. There they will call for every fruit in serenity. There they will never taste death, beyond the first death, and He will protect them from the punishment of hellfire. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among the dwellers of paradise. Ameen. Surah Jasiyah. Let's take a look at the flow chart of microstructure of Surah Al-Jasiyah, which was revealed in the 7th year of prophethood in Makkah. The central subject of this surah is the realization that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created this universe with a purpose. The surah begins with a mention of the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala upon us. Then from verse 18 to 20, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders us not to follow those who do not have proper knowledge about Islam. The right knowledge of our deen can only be found in the Quran and the Sunnah. As long as you stick to those, you will be on the straight path. Now we come to verse 21, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do the evildoers imagine that we shall make them equal to those who believe and do good, making their lives and death alike? How vile is their judgment? This verse is an answer to the people who think that because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Rahman and Rahim, they will get into Jannah no matter how they behave behave in this world. How can we expect that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to overlook the differences between the two and give them both the same end? Can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be that unjust? Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 23, have you seen, O Prophet, those who have taken their own desires as their gods? And so Allah has left them to stray knowingly, sealing their hearings and hearts and placing a cover on their sight. Who then can guide them after Allah? Will you all not then be mindful? How can anyone take his desires as his God? By becoming a slave to what his heart wishes for. It doesn't matter to him whether Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala likes something or not. If he likes it, then he will do it. When this happens, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seals his hearing and heart. No word of advice moves them, no argument appeals to them. Their mind remains busy day and night, only thinking of ways to fulfill their own interests and desires in every possible way. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in verse 34 and 35, it will be said, this day we will neglect you as you neglected the meeting of this day of yours. Your home will be the fire and you will have no helpers. This is because you made a mockery of Allah's revelations and you were deluded by your worldly life. So from that day on, they will not be taken out of the fire, nor will they be asked to make amends. Allahumma ajirna minan nar. O Allah, protect us from hellfire. Ameen. This brings us to the question I'm going to ask myself today. The question is, do I sometimes make my desires as my God? Inshallah, we will meet again tomorrow with the next para. Allah Hafiz.